This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Prior to the past legislative session, Governor Landry promised a framework that would move people from homelessness to housing. While the governor had some successes, homelessness was one area that faced resistance, primarily from the Senate. We'll look at where the battle lines were drawn. Elsewhere, an old New Orleans expression refers to shoppers making groceries. Well, soon there will be an additional place to do that as the city's first Trader Joe's opens. One shopper who's been making deals is Gayle Benson, who just purchased the 1515 Poydras office tower, the latest in several major business district investments. Less productive to date have been plans for Bourbon Street security. Consultants have been busy, but there has been little follow-up. There's been plenty of action in Omaha, where LSU's baseball team may be on the verge of another national championship, and in Oklahoma City, where the NBA title could go to a team that is located there because of a New Orleans team once needing refuge from Hurricane Katrina. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Sophie Kazikoff, staff writer for the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and Tony McCauley, also staff writer for the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. And we go over to Sophie first because the legislative session just ended, and there were a couple of pieces of legislation that were brought up for consideration regarding homelessness, not just in the city of New Orleans, but also across the state. They didn't make it out. What happened?
Right. So these were two bills that were proposed that would have essentially cracked down on homeless encampments. And one was focused on, it would have criminalized homeless encampments and also would have created a homeless court system where people who are experiencing homelessness would enter potentially into this other process where they would undergo mental health or other sort of treatment, hopefully on the way to something else. The other one.
That piece of legislation would have been statewide, or was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
Both of these are statewide, were statewide proposals. The other was sort of focused on holding municipalities accountable for banning homeless encampments and would have allowed residents and business owners to actually sue municipalities if they did not maintain public camping bans. So both of these were proposed, discussed, debated, incurred quite a lot of pushback from homeless advocates and New Orleans officials who sort of went repeatedly to the Capitol to share concerns with legislators about these bills, and then both of them did not ultimately come up for a final full vote.
Did they get through committee, either of these bills?
Yeah.
Okay, but they didn't advance beyond that.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, this was an issue that was important to the governor. I mean, you remember earlier this year, he sort of took over what was happening in New Orleans in terms of homelessness, and he had opened a big shelter, which is closed now, right?
Yeah.
That went out in New Orleans East area?
That was closed after, it was like more in Gentilly area. So it was a few months, and that was always sort of the proposed intention was to house people. It was launched around the time of the Super Bowl, when the governor was very invested in getting people sort of off the streets during that time. And then people were moved from there into housing, but not everyone. There were, a number of people that sort of left on their own before entering into housing.
So those who oppose this, and there was a lot of opposition apparently to it, why? What was the opposition based on?
I think a lot of the advocates were speaking from a point of sort of concern that criminalizing homelessness wouldn't actually address some of the sort of root causes of why people become homeless, and that in fact having someone end up with a criminal record could actually make it more difficult for them to get into housing later on, whether that's because they would face a challenge from a landlord who wouldn't want to rent to them, or just because it sort of delays the whole process if someone is going through this criminal process potentially.
So what is New Orleans doing in terms of homelessness? And do we have as many encampments now as though have those really not, resettled?
Right. So yeah, we've talked about this before. This is sort of a 2-year now. I think we're in, process that the city has undergone to move people from the encampments into housing. They just presented the sort of update on where they're at this week in a council committee meeting, and they shared that they've housed a significant portion of the people from encampments that they had identified sort of when they launched this process, and are really at this point, because they've housed people from the majority of the encampments, are focusing on moving people from the low barrier shelter into housing now. And they sort of have this idea that if they can keep that up longer term, move people out of the shelter more quickly, move people from the streets into the shelter, and sort of have a more, through line where people don't just sort of get stuck either on the street or in shelter, which sort of was the situation for a long time.
So is trying to shelter people, actually offering them housing, are they finding success with that? Are many people being housed?
Yeah, I can't tell you sort of the overall success rate of like how many people are like remaining in housing. That's not a number that we have exactly. So there have been concerns that have come up about, well, people get into housing and then do they always have the full access that they need to different services? Are caseworkers as available? People have really enormous caseloads, and a lot of these mental health and treatment programs that people might also want access to can be very limited in sort of what's available. So those challenges certainly continue to come up and be a challenge with all of this. But from what the city was saying, they definitely are feeling optimistic about sort of the rate of housing relative to what they had planned when they launched this. Yeah.
Is this being perceived by the legislators as a New Orleans issue? So who cares, or are there those problems throughout the state?
Yeah, I mean, I think New Orleans certainly has the highest rate of homelessness, and in that sense, when this was being debated and sort of pushed back on, it ended up taking on definitely a sort of state legislators who might not be here kind of taking this up and advocates.
Do we ever hear anybody from Shreveport or Baton Rouge saying, hey, we got this problem too?
Can't speak to everything that was said during the committee meetings, but I definitely think there's a feeling for sure that this tends to be a New Orleans-focused issue. And one of the legislators that brought a bill was Representative Alonzo Knox, who is a New Orleans legislator. So he's coming, at this from the perspective of, he said, concerns that his constituents here have raised.
Okay.
Yeah.
But didn't make it out of the legislative session. Will we see it again, you think?
I would imagine so in some way, shape, or form. I actually didn't hear very specifically from either legislator on that question, so can't say for sure. But
all right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Sophie. Okay, Tony, let's go on over to you, because Gayle Benson has another building.
She bought a building, yeah. She bought an office tower down on Poydras Street, right directly across from the Superdome. It's kind of two things here. There's what she's doing and her investment portfolio, and then the office market. So she obviously owns the Saints and the Pelicans, which is the main source of her wealth, but it doesn't make a huge amount of income. So she has a portfolio of a lot of other interests that obviously we track, things like the car businesses, which she was investing in recently when she picked up some investments from the Brandt estate. Growth businesses here, and one of the things that she's been concentrating on in the last couple of years is real estate in the region. She bought a company called Corporate Realty, which is going to be the manager of this new building that she bought, which is 1515 Poydras. It was there's 15 of these so-called Class A office buildings downtown. And like everywhere else in the country, these buildings have been suffering from changing work patterns for office workers. The nationwide the occupancy is still at a record low, down about 25%, or at about 75%, so down 25%. And there's been a lot of conversions. So this particular building was right in the middle of a proposed conversion, with the top 7 floors being converted into apartments and condos. So it'll be interesting to see what she decides to do with this. She owns, or she's one of the equity owners in the Hyatt Regency right across the road. She owns Benson Tower, which is primarily government employees that are in there, which was part of the deal when they did the previous lease for the Saints, over 10 years ago. They're right in the middle of, or they're almost at the end of renegotiating that lease. So they, her advisors described it as another investment in her neighborhood because she has quite a lot of interest right along Poydras Street there.
Mercedes-Benz dealership?
The Mercedes-Benz dealership at a block away, and Champion Square, of course, which came as part of that Benson Tower package deal that they did way back. So it's really, it's kind of, they framed it as her making a bet on the city, on that part of the city, on the charity hospital investment, which has kind of been stalled for a while, but looks like it might have made progress and come back on track pretty soon, which is going to be, a big key part of the development of this biomedical hub that, is a big part of the economic development plan for the city.
What are people thinking? Okay, you got an office building, you want to convert it, you want to have offices back there. Is that going to happen, that people can go back to offices in the traditional way that they used to be, or with everybody working at home now?
I think we've got to a stabilized situation at a lower level. Cities all across, cities the same size as New Orleans and larger cities. There's a big project in Manhattan that I was just reading about that's a major conversion into residential. I mean, to the topic of homelessness, it's a good idea to add residential. The Plaza Tower, I've talked on this show about it before. The latest plan for that, if it makes progress, is to put housing in there for folks that need subsidized housing, seniors. So there's, if there is a permanent change in work patterns such that there's a lot of available space for conversion, if it's done right, it could be a good thing,
So occupancy here in the New Orleans area, in terms of these big buildings and businesses, what is it? Does that match the national rate too? Down about 25%?
It's been, it's kind of building by building. There's some buildings here. Her building is 100% occupied. Sorry, the Benson Tower is 100% occupied. The one she just bought is 20% occupied, but that's partly because I was just saying it was in the middle of clearing out, or had cleared out the top part. 1010 Common is it in converting to 2 hotels. I think it's 2 hotel brands they're putting in there. And her company that she bought, one of the things that she has done in a couple of different cities is take over the management of buildings where the owners went bankrupt essentially, and that includes the Energy Center, where the owner had financial difficulties, but the building itself is actually pretty well occupied, about 90%. So it's a mixed picture. But what often is happening is that tenants move out of this building and move across the street for better rates, So what we need is more, what every city needs, like New Orleans is, you need more new businesses coming into the city to kind of, stabilize.
Is there a demand for hotels, or are we at the saturation point with that?
Well, what people in the hotel sector tell me is that, again, it's kind of different types of properties. So we haven't had a big major hotel built here since the Sheraton in I think the late 70s. So people are quite keen to see this proposed new headquarters hotel for the convention center, which would be, I'm trying to remember the number, 1,000 rooms. There hasn't been a hotel like that built in decades. But there's been many kind of conversions of these smaller office.
A lot of boutique hotels.
A lot of boutique hotels, coming out of every crevice. But there seems to be, a decent enough amount of demand for them. It's just that in a city like ours, you get big seasonal fluctuations, So you have to manage them to take that into account,
So this latest one, now owned by Ms. Benson, is directly across the street from the Superdome, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So that is now being called her neighborhood.
That's what they say.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mrs. Benson's neighborhood.
All right. Thanks a lot, Tony. Okay, Sophie, over to you, too. There was a lot of talk, and continues to be, about security for Bourbon Street, particularly after what happened on January 1st, the terrorist attack, and maybe closing down Bourbon Street. But there are a lot of folks who say, hold on.
Right. So the idea has been to, think about maybe closing more of Bourbon Street to vehicles more of the time, currently, it's closed to vehicles sort of for those passing through beginning in the evening, beginning at 8 p.m., but cars can still cross across Bourbon Street during that time, and then it's only during special events that the city actually closes it sort of all the way around. So there was this, very highly anticipated report from a consulting firm that the police chief commissioned, and that came out a couple of months ago now, and they proposed that the sort of way to make Bourbon Street fully secure would be to close it to cars basically fully, as much of the day as possible, with maybe a few hours for businesses to accept deliveries and things like that. But this proposal has sort of generated a lot of pushback from a lot of different people, from business owners who are worried about access to their businesses, from residents who say that this would sort of just expand the entertainment sort of footprint. And there's concerns about traffic and how this would really essentially divide the French Quarter more or less into two parts. So there's a lot still that people, think needs to be done before any decisions can be sort of made on that.
Okay, so discussion still going on. I know another issue that came up was when the Bourbon Street is closed down at night, that is police officers are the ones setting up the barricades, and there was discussion or thought, well, maybe we should get somebody else to do that.
Right. So yeah, this was all sort of being debated this week in a council committee meeting. And it was actually the first time that this consultant report had been discussed publicly. And one piece of what the consultants pointed out was, concerns about sort of lack of coordination between different city agencies regarding closure. And this sort of became a topic of discussion. Who is responsible for putting these barriers out now that, instead of just having officers, which they might have done in the past, they actually have these larger barriers, which many people who have been to the French Quarter recently may have seen. They take a lot of hours, apparently, to be set up every night. So police officers currently are the ones doing that, 8th District police officers. There was concern from council members and from NOPD as well that this is not the best use of officer time, perhaps, and questions about whether this should be something that city agencies are responsible for or a contractor. So this was sort of, a fairly, energetic conversation the other day at City Council. Yeah.
And it sounds like much more to be discussed about all this, too. Okay, Sophie, thanks so much. Yeah. Okay, E, you wanted to talk about baseball and basketball and connections to New Orleans.
There are two stories coming out of the central part of the country that involve championships and that involve this area. The first is in Omaha, where the LSU is playing for yet another national championship. They've won 7. This is in the College World Series. And so they're playing at the team called the East Carolina Chanticleers. And you ask, well, what is a Chanticleer? A Chanticleer is sort of like an angry rooster, and it comes from a character in Canterbury Tales. So this is kind of an uppity sort of school, to name your characters after that. But anyway, those two play the best 2 out of 3 series beginning Sunday, and LSU certainly has precedent. LSU has always been thought of as a football school, and certainly is, but it has become also the dominant college baseball school too, and so it's really done well. And in Louisiana, since the Zephyrs left, we don't have any professional baseball. So the closest we have to professional baseball is LSU's baseball team, and they may even be better than some of the minor leagues team. But anyway, it's going to be a weekend. But the other interesting story is that Sunday in Oklahoma City, the Oklahoma City Thunder are playing for the championship against Indiana, against the Indiana Pacers. The story about the Thunder is interesting because in 2005, after Katrina, the arena here was left in bad shape. We had the Hornets, and the NBA said, you're not going to be able to play this here next season and maybe the next one. There's too much damage. So the NBA commissioner knew that Oklahoma City, which is a town that nobody thinks of for professional big-time sports, had built a new arena. Kind of like in Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. Well, the people in Oklahoma say, damn, let's do that. And so they built an NBA quality arena, either for NBA or NHL, whoever they could get. And then all of a sudden, the NBA is knocking on their door and says, hey, man, we've heard about this arena. And so they made an agreement that the Hornets would play there for 1 or perhaps 2 seasons. which was to the chagrin of people in New Orleans because already the Saints were playing in San Antonio, but there was nothing else to do. So that season they went and they played, and they were a huge success. The people in Oklahoma City embraced them. The attendance was better than it was in New Orleans, and it became very successful. And so the Hornets played there for 2 seasons with the intent of coming back to New Orleans, which they did. But meanwhile, over in Seattle had a team for a long time, and it wasn't doing well. They had an old rundown arena. The team wanted a new arena, but they needed government support. So they said, no, we can't help you. Went back and forth. And finally, the owner of Seattle says, we're going to move. They heard about what was happening, about this great arena in Oklahoma City. So Seattle wound up moving to Oklahoma City. And the Seattle was called the Supersonics. Oklahoma City said, well, let's call it the Thunder. That's kind of like a big noise sort of name. And so the franchise moved there. And it's been successful. It's taken years, but this year it's in the finals and could, by Sunday night be the NBA champion. But it's all this chain of events that started with Katrina in the arena here, not allowing the Hornets to play, and then the Hornets having to go play in Oklahoma City, and then ultimately Seattle. Meanwhile, the NBA gave Charlotte, which is where the Hornets came from, a franchise of its own, and they wanted the Hornets name back. Tom Benson at the time owned the name Hornets, and so they gave it back to him. And so there's the Charlotte Hornets again. But in Charlotte and in Seattle, it was the same issue. You had an established team. You had an arena that was getting run down. The team needed help. The city said no, and the team left, and it just changed things. And so I just think it's an interesting chain of events.
It definitely is. Great stories. And, of course, we're saying go Tigers. We'd love to see them come back with another national championship. Okay, thanks, E. All right, Tony, let's wrap it on up with you because folks in the city of New Orleans now are going to have their own Trader Joe's.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, on the one hand, it's great to have one of these kind of hip, quirky, community type places that everybody wants. When you go online, everybody gets super excited about having a Trader Joe's. They've got affordable, kind of own brand type stuff. But the other thing about it is that it's back to the theme of economic development. It's going to be smack in the middle of this bio district that we're trying to get going right next to the VA and UMC hospital complex.
So it's on Tulane Avenue.
I'm sorry, the first one on Tulane Avenue. There's another one coming in uptown at the Ferret Street corridor, which is another little boom area of the city. So they're seen as, when you get these kinds of things, you get Chick-fil-A's and these sort of things. They're little indicators of economic life, and it's particularly good for the plans that they already have afoot for the bio district, where they're improving bus shelters, doing landscaping, and a lot of other kind of things along Tulane Avenue, particularly. So that's people are happy to see that. It's going to open in August now after a long process of getting permissions and stuff.
And the Tulane area is already kind of off in the mid-city. It's sort of rich with supermarkets already. They have a Rouse, they have on Carrollton, they have a Winn-Dixie across the street.
There's a Whole Foods. The closest one is closest to that one. It's not a desert, for sure. But when you're trying to place make, as they call it, the buzzword for economic development, you're looking for very specific. Pieces of development, and the one that the boosters of the bio district in here in New Orleans point to St. Louis, where they had similar ambitions 20, 30 years ago, which were slow going. And what really turned the corner for the Cortex, as it's called in St. Louis, was when they got an IKEA right down there. And that was like the turning point to get that going. That's why I don't want to overdo it. I mean, it's nice to have a Trader Joe's in this spot, but it does have that added significance.
So give us a frame of reference exactly where on Tulane?
It is literally, where the old Faubourg Brewery Tower is. It's right next to that.
Okay. Now, the community has shown real interest in Trader Joe's because we've had one in the metro area in Jefferson on Jefferson Parish on Veterans, and that has been enormously successful. Parking lots never empty there.
Yeah, people love them. I mean, that's why you want to have them. There's been one in Baton Rouge since 2013, one in on vets, as you said, since I think about 2016, 17. I should also mention there's one coming to Lafayette. So I mean it's California-based kind of hippie thing that started in the 60s. This brand, but they've maintained a pretty low profile nationally. They're only at about 600 stores nationally, which for grocery chains is not very large, which is part of the cachet also. They've been expanding a bit more recently, so for Louisiana it's nice to get 3 new ones in pretty close proximity.
That's great. So is it $2 chuck, $3 chuck? Where are we now with the wines? Do you know? $1 chuck, $2 chuck? You know what I'm talking about, Tony?
Really important information.
It's
really,
I haven't been around
I
to find out.
can't speak to it either. Apparently, they have really cheap boxed wine.
Yes, I know what you mean, but I don't buy my wine there.
So we don't know. But at any rate, people do like to get their wine there for the $1 or $2 or $3, or maybe it's more now $1.
Yeah. Well, I can see why it's popular then.
And if you do develop condos around it, that's certainly a selling point for someone to want to be in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, we had that LSU student accommodation come in about a year and a half ago. Pretty $100 million investment. They tore down the cafe there, which the old Greasy Spoon, which was sad news for some people, but probably going to see condos go in there for sure.
Okay, all right, guys. Time for other stories. E, over to you.
Well, at the time of the year, they're getting announcements of kings and queens, and the announcement was made about the king and queen of the upcoming Washington Mardi Gras ball. The king is going to be a guy named Gray Stream, very rich man out of Lake Charles, but important locally is Sarah Hebe is going to be the queen. She's the daughter of businessman Fred Hebe, known for, among the things he owns, River Birch Landfill, and he was the king in 23. So she's a royal family in Washington.
All righty. Sophie, over to you.
Well, we have a mayor's race coming up. It's been a pretty quiet sort of election season so far, but we're kind of anticipating having some more news coming out of the race as we're getting closer.
Absolutely. Okay, Tony, over to you.
I was here a couple of weeks back talking about the crisis of the fairgrounds, and weren't going to have a horse racing season this year, but they were looking for a public subsidy after losing some slot money after a court decision, but I reported last week that they had a gentleman's agreement, and they're going to, this Tuesday, have a meeting to say it's back on. A gentleman's agreement seems to be code for climb down by the owners, Churchill Downs. They didn't get their subsidy, but they're going to go ahead and have a racing season this year.
Okay, all righty, guys. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for joining us. We will see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.